The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Lord to you, Lord.
Please be seated.
As Jesus walked along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, was it his sin or his parents' sin that caused him to be born blind?" "Neither," answered Jesus. "It was no sin, either of this man or of his parents. Rather, it was to let God's work show forth in him. We must do deeds of the one who sent me while it is day. The night comes on when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." With that, Jesus spat on the ground and made mud with his saliva and smeared the man's eyes with the mud. "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam." When the man went off and washed and came back able to see.
His neighbors and the people who had been accustomed to seeing him begging began to ask, "Isn't this the fellow who used to sit and beg?" Some were claiming it was he, others maintained it was not, but someone who looked like him. The man himself said, "I am the one, all right." "How were your eyes opened?" "That man they called Jesus made mud and smeared it on my eyes, telling me to go to Siloam and wash. When I did go and wash, I was able to see." "Where is he?" they asked. He replied, "I have no idea."
Of my mind, the day gave my sight to me. It was not sin that made me blind. It was no sinner made me see. I once was blind and now I see.
Next, they took the man who had been born blind to the Pharisees. Note that it was on a Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud paste and opened his eyes. The Pharisees, in turn, began to inquire how he had recovered his sight. "He put mud on my eyes. I washed it off, and now I can see." This prompted some of the Pharisees to assert, "This man cannot be from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others objected, "If a man is a sinner, how can he perform signs like these?" They were sharply divided over him. Then they addressed the blind man again. "Since it was your eyes he opened, what do you have to say about him? He is a prophet."
The religious leaders refused to believe that he had been born blind and had begun to see, until they summoned the parents of this man who now could see. "Is this your son? And if so, how do you attest that he was blind at birth? How do you account for the fact he can now see?" His parents answered, "We know this is our son, and we know that he was blind at birth. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we have no idea. Ask him. He is old enough to speak for himself." His parents answered this in fashion because they were afraid of religious leaders, who already agreed among themselves that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, "He's of age. Ask him."
A second time they summoned the man who had been born blind. "Give glory to God. First of all, we know this man is a sinner. I would not know whether he is a sinner or not. I know this much. I was blind before, now I can see." They persisted. "Just what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" "I have told you once, but you would not listen to me. Why do you want to hear it all over again? Do not tell me you want to become his disciples too." You are the one who is that man's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we have no idea where this man comes from."
Let others call my faith a lie, or try to stir up doubt in me. Look at me now, none can deny. I once was blind and now I see. I once was blind and now I see.
Well, this is news. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but that if someone is devout and obeys God's will, God listens. It is unheard of that anyone ever gave sight to a person blind from birth. If this man were not from God, he could never have done such a thing. What? You are steeped in sin from your birth and you are giving us lectures? With that, they threw him out bodily.
When Jesus heard of this expulsion, he sought him out and asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" "You have seen him," Jesus replied. "He is speaking to you now." "I do believe, Lord." And the man bowed down to worship him. Then Jesus said, "I came into the world to divide it, to make the sightless see and the seeing blind."
Some of the Pharisees around him picked this up, saying, "You are not counting us in with the blind, are you?" To which Jesus replied, "If you were blind, there would be no sin in that. But we see, you say, and your sin remains."
Ask me not how, but I know who has opened up new worlds to me. This Jesus does what none can do. I once was blind and now I see. I once was blind and now I see.
The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Oh, it's another good story. I have to admit today to being a little bit flummoxed. I think one of the great blessings of my life, and today though feels more like a curse, is that getting to spend so much time with the scriptures and learning so much about them, that I come to a day like today and this story is so rich and there is so much in it that we could be here, well, we could hang out till 2 talking about everything that goes on in this story. It's just so remarkable. And yet in a matter of 10 minutes, I'm supposed to unpack something for you from it, because it really is pretty remarkable. I mean, John, when he writes his gospel, thank goodness for it, because it gives us a whole different perspective on Jesus than Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Just for example, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, very often, most of the time, before a miracle can happen, the prerequisite is that faith is present. So often Jesus says to people, go your way, your faith has healed you. Or he says, I've never found faith like this in Israel, so this miracle happens. He even says about his hometown in Mark's gospel that he was so amazed by their lack of faith that he could really do nothing there at all. So in Matthew, Mark, Luke, usually it's, if you've got the faith, something miraculous will happen. Not in John. In John, the miracles, or as we've talked about, John calls them signs, come first to elicit faith, to bring faith out. And I think both of those are in action in our relationship with Christ. Of course, then you may remember last week, the Samaritan woman at the well, I mentioned to you quickly how when she started her conversation with Jesus, she said to him, why are you talking to me, sir? And then she moved on to say, well, I can see you're a prophet. And by the end of the story, she's around saying, this might be the Messiah, how she grows in faith. The same is true of the man born blind. When he's asked who cured him, he says, well, the man who did it. Then under questioning from the Pharisees, he says, he is a prophet. And by the end of the story, he bows down and worships Jesus, recognizing the divinity. So there's this whole pattern of how we grow in faith, how we come to recognize Christ. And that's just starting. That's just starting. But if I'm hard-pressed, I think what I would want to say today is this, that given all the interesting details of the story, the point of it, I think, is pretty clear. And it's simply this: there are none as blind as those who will not see. None as blind as those who will not see. And I think I want to speak about that because I don't want that to be us. I don't want that to be us. You're going to love this, or at least I love this. If you noticed in the story, the man born blind is never given a name. We don't know what his name is. And interestingly, the word John uses in his gospel for this man in Greek is anthropos, which is a word that sort of just stands for a human being. It doesn't indicate any particular gender. It doesn't indicate any particular ethnicity. It doesn't particularly indicate any particular historical context. It's simply humanity. The blind man is supposed to be us. It's humanity. We're supposed to find our story in him just as we found our story in the woman at the well. Blind anthropos, blind humanity, blind you, blind me. It's so intriguing. The blind beggar's just there doing his blind beggar business, right? He's doing what he's done every day for the rest of his life, for the rest of his adult life, just sitting there being. And the disciples and Jesus walk casually by, and the disciples have a question. Is he blind because of his sin or because of someone else's sin, his parents' sin or what? Jesus is going to let the glory of God show through this man, he says, by revealing to the disciples and to those around him how that's not how things work. So once again, without being asked, Jesus steps up. He goes to the blind man, makes that mud paste clay stuff, puts it on his eyes, and says to the guy, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. What an interesting interaction. Can you imagine if you've been blind all your life and suddenly someone comes up and slaps mud on your face and tells you, go and wash? Like, yeah, I want to get this off my face. But how strange an experience that would have been. And the guy gets up and does it. And his life is transformed. Very much the same with us. Christ comes toward us. And what I think we're supposed to see in this clay, in this mud, is you may recall that from the 2nd chapter of Genesis, where God creates humanity out of the clay of the earth, out of the mud of the earth. Jesus here is completing creation, bringing it to completion when he puts the mud on the man's eyes. But, as I've said before, quoting Augustine, the God who made you without your consent isn't going to save you without your consent. You're involved. You got to get in on the scene. And so when Jesus says, go and wash, the man does it. If he had not participated, if he had not been willing to do his part, he would have sat there blind forever. But he goes, and it changes his life. It's transformed. And then the drama really begins. Because once this changed person shows up, this person who has encountered Christ and the power of Christ in his life shows up, everybody around doesn't know what to do with that. They start to panic. They start to make excuses. They start to try to find reasons why what they're seeing right in front of them and what the man is telling them repeatedly cannot possibly be true. The excuses run left, right, and center all over the board. This isn't the same guy, they say. This clearly isn't the same guy. He's like, nope, it's really me. All right, well then, obviously you were not blind from birth, right? That you've been faking all the time. You're not blind from birth. The parents say, no, he was. Well, then you tell us, how's it that he was cured? He's of age, ask him. I'm not getting involved in this. Well, obviously the guy who did it for you couldn't have really done it. Let's dismiss Jesus and downplay what he did because he's a sinner. He's got to be a sinner. Well, then how would God have worked through him? All right, we've had enough. Get out of here. Finally, we just don't want to know. We don't want to acknowledge anything to keep God at arm's length, to keep Christ away, to stop acknowledging the fact that God is present working. Why? I think they're afraid. Because if God is present working, then everything around them starts to change. They're going to have to start to change the way they see what God is about and how God works. They're going to have to start to transform how they understand themselves. They might be given new sight, a new understanding of things and how they are to be in the world. But they don't want that. So they remain blind and will do anything they can to stay blind. There are none so blind as those who cannot see. Excuses, excuses, excuses. That's what John wants to say to us. Don't be the blind. Don't make the excuses. Don't try to keep your eyes closed to the reality that is here. Because, in all honesty, I think we do that. We try to come up with excuses to keep God at an arm's length, to avoid the reality that He is here, very near, and that the unfathomable power of His love is at work transforming the world right now. But if we can keep Him at arm's length, then we don't have to pay attention to that, and it doesn't have to change us. And so we come up with all kinds of excuses. I'm just too tired today to have prayer time. I'm too busy, too much going on. So I'll get to God later. I'll get to my faith later. I'll take care of learning more about it later. You know, they used to drag me to church when I was a kid and I hated it, so I'm done going. I find it boring. The church is out of step with the times. Oh, you know what? I can go next week. This week, I want to golf. There's something else happening. We find all these excuses to put God aside, to ignore that He is nearby, that He is right here. Because if we acknowledge that, it just might change us. If we acknowledge that God is right here in our lives, very near, not at an arm's length, with His amazing love doing miraculous things, then we might have to look at things differently. We might have to change how we are in the world. There might be things that we like to do that we might have to stop doing. There might be websites that we should not be going to anymore. There might be activities that we engage in that we need to pull back from. There might be attitudes and judgments and positions we hold that just need to change. There might be ways that we waste our money that we have to redo that. It could change everything, and we don't want that. Blind anthropos, blind humanity. Here, I think, is the great blindness humanity suffers from. We do not know how close God is, and we don't want to know. Put aside the excuses and be honest for a minute and recognize this. In all those excuses, it's simply this: I do not want to give God the priority in everything in my life. That's the fact. I own that for myself. I do not want to give God the priority in everything in my life, because if it does, if He gets that, then I have to change. I can't live how I want to. I'm going to have to live differently. So let me stay blind to it. There's no one as blind as those who will not see His nearness, His love. Being blind is not a sin. choosing blindness is a whole other matter. And sometimes I think we just get sort of comfortable with where our faith life is at, where our relationship or lack of relationship with God is at, and we'll just stay there, blind, thinking we're happy, thinking it works. The great feast of God's unfathomable love for us is coming soon, the Triduum, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday. It is nothing but the story of God's love for us. And this season of Lent is, if you will, our stumbling toward the pool of Siloam so that we can wash the mud off our eyes and see clearly how close He is and how much He loves us. And yes, that changes everything. There are none so blind as those who will not see. John's gospel speaks powerfully to us if we let it. The man born blind is us. The good news is he ends up seeing and worshiping God as he should. May we learn the lesson, and in this Lenten season, give God the priority so that we can see anew and be anew. And let us stand